Hello, everybody. So this is the first video lecture on Chapter 2 in Childhood Growth and Development. And this chapter is Conception, Heredity, Prenatal Development. So in this chapter, it's really about or introducing the role, the relationship between nature and nurture. And some of this stuff, if you've had childhood growth and development, if you've had human growth and development, it should be familiar. And probably if you took anatomy and physiology and biology, you're familiar with some of this. But there are a couple terms on here that are I wouldn't say they're new or contemporary, but I didn't learn them when I was in school. And the first one here is this term right here, epigenetics. So epigenetics is it's a term that refers to the relationship between the environment and genes, or sometimes you've heard nature and nurture. But specifically, what this concept is about is the way that the environment influences the expression of genes. So the idea is that yes, we have these genes, or what I'll talk about in another slide. I'll specify what I mean by genes, but we have these biological variables, but the environment influences the activation, if you will, of our genetic code, and that's what we mean by epigenetics. A couple other words here to introduce is the idea of a polygenetic, which simply means most things are polygenetic. There's not like a gene for any specific thing, like skin color. Skin color is polygenetic. And multifactorial, and that's just a fancy word for there's lots of factors. The epigenetic framework is a multifactorial way. There's a really great book out called The Myth of Normal. It's quite big. There's a fellow by the name of Mattei who spends a lot of his books are about this epigenetic framework. And I just say that in case you're interested in doing some extra learning. All right, so now there's this next discussion down here, this next box, the environmental correlations. These are just, and again, if you've taken human growth and development, this should be a repeat, but these are different ways of describing the relationship between the environment and genes. So you have this first concept here, what we call passive correlation, passive environmental correlation. And what that simply means is a person will develop a trait, and that trait may be, it may be a physical trait, the way they look. It may be a characteristic of how they interact in the world. And the idea of a passive trait is the notion that you inherited the gene, so you didn't do anything, and you're born into the environment that activates or exercise that gene, right? So you just passively become. So sometimes I use the example of your textbook uses the example of athletic ability. So you're born with the genes to have an athletic bodily structure, and your parents are also very athletic. So you become athletic yourself. You just passively became. You have this next one, evocative or evocative. So the way I think about this one, or the way I try to help students remember it, is if you take that word apart, it's like to evoke, right? You try to pull something out. So the evocative correlation between genes and the environment is that you have, what does it say? The environment responds to. So you may have some genetic traits, but the environment calls those things out, or it creates an opportunity for the expression. And I don't remember what your textbook uses as an example here, but one that might work well for an evocative is you may have inherited the genetic tendency towards substance addiction, and then you grow up in an environment where lots of people are using substances, so you develop substance addiction. On the other hand, another example probably of evocative is you've inherited these characteristics, but your environment has no opportunities for you to use substances, so you don't become an abuser or an user yourself. So the notion here is that you have these traits, but they don't become. The environment does or does not evoke. And then the third one is niche picking. Sometimes it's called niche picking, sometimes it's called active. But in this case, it's where you have the characteristics, but there's nothing in the environment that necessarily activates them. But you, the individual, seeks out opportunities. So maybe you have naturally you have a very good voice, but you don't have any opportunities as a child to sing or to use your voice. But as an adult, you then find or create or seek out opportunities to be in choirs or perform in a band. There's nothing in the environment which you grew up in that gives you that opportunity, but as an adult, you seek them out. So you actively pick that niche is kind of what that means. Um, in the human growth and development in the other class, I talked about these concepts, but I talked about them in a slightly less genetic sort of framework. Okay, so now in the this slide offers some more textbook terms, right, about what we mean by heredity, and specifically, and again, I hope you got some of this in your high school biology class, or are getting some of this in your high school biology class. For our purposes, we're really going to focus. Well, I don't know. We're not. This isn't a genetics course, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time. But understand that genes are. I like to think of they're the recipes. They're the things that are going to tell the other things how to be. Chromosomes are the recipe book, which there where all of these are stored. What you have over here, this image right here, are images of the 23 pairs of genes. You get half from your mother, you get half from your father. But I'm assuming you know that half are in sperm, half are in the egg, and they're all the same size except for the 23rd pair. And this is what we call the sex chromosomes. You get an X, I'm sorry, you get an X or a Y. Yeah, you get an X or a Y from your father. You get an X from your mother. You will always get an X from your mother, but it's the father that decides, it's the sperm that decides what the sex of the offspring is going to be. If the father contributes a X, you become or the offspring is genetically a female. If the father contributes a Y, the offspring is genetically a male. But I haven't say that there are other things that also occur in nature. And some of these examples are a person might be an XXY, triple X, or they may have an X and the other one contributed by the other parent. Something happens to it, and that's what we would be an XO, or a person could also be an XYY. I'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide when we get to sex trait disorders. There's a lot on this slide, and I don't want to rush through it. And again, I'm trying to wrap these up in 10 minutes. So I'm probably going to stop here. When I pick up the next slide, though, I want to talk about some of the terms associated with genes and the expression of those genes. What we mean by genotype, that's what the genes are. So let me go back here. These little images over here would be like your genotype. Those are the genes that you get, a person inherits. A phenotype, way you can remember this one is it kind of looks like photograph. A phenotype is what it actually looks like when those genes are expressed. I'm going to stop here and pick up in the next video.